Hey everybody, thanks for coming. I'll go ahead and get started. I know it's 5:30. Thanks for coming to the session. I'm going to discuss, you see how UC Davis uses InterSystems API Manager to handle incoming requests to provide FHIR and custom APIs to our business partners. A little bit about our hospital. I won't go over all of this, but we have a few clinics. We're located in Northern California, Sacramento, and outlying areas and clinics. You can see we have about 1 million visits a day, about 1 million visits, ER visits 69,000 a year, and 94 admits per day. This is the statistics about our hospital. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've recently started using InterSystems API Manager to deal with how we handle our APIs. Us in the healthcare industry, we've seen recently that there are some changes in the industry that involve, if you've heard of 21st Century Cures Act, and what happens is we're going to be required to provide more APIs to our patients, and we have to interoperate with APIs. So we're going to have to provide more APIs to our patients and give them capability to interact with their healthcare data. So this changes the way we deal with things right now because we have to figure out a smarter way to deal with the APIs that we deal with. And so when I say APIs, I wanted to say from the fundamental, I'm talking about requests and responses from whether it be a patient, an application, or a payer, but they're going to send us requests from one endpoint to another endpoint. It could be in JSON, and we send a response back. So 21st Century Cures Act is kind of telling us that we have to make EHR data available through APIs and other data stores. So it may not just be our backend for our Epic backends. We're going to have more areas where patient data is located, and we're going to have to be required to interoperate with those locations. So we have to put a vision in to how we deal with APIs. Right now, from my experience, I would say sometimes you can lose track of API inventory. We might have a project. In my experience, from a personal project, I might create an API that will reach out to our Epic backend using a patient's medical record number and tell us if there's any standing orders or what's the most current order for that patient. That might be a need by a project, an application, or someone that we're working with, and they just want to send a request and get a response back. Today, I might make that, put it in our system, build it in Iris, and the next request that comes through might be something similar for another developer, another engineer, who may not know that something like that already exists. So they may create duplicate APIs, or they might implement their own security structures, or we might not even know, they don't know they can leverage the API that I've already built. And that's just speaking from personal experience. So again, we have to find a better way, a smarter way to deal with APIs where we all know that they're documented, we know what they do, we know how to use them, and the organization has some insight into that. So that's not what I mean when I said we're going to do FHIR. So the question comes like, we have the problem, what do we do about the problem? Why would we use API Manager? Why would we use IAM? So now you get visibility, you get governance, you get security, you get some type of insight to your APIs. You might be able to see an API, how often it's being used. You might see how often it's not being used and retire that API. You can also document. You create an API, you document it, and you can have an intelligent way to describe to another developer, here's all the parameters that you use, here's how you send a request, and here's what your response can look like. So you can do onboarding with other developers faster. You can look at vitals of your system. You can implement securities like rate limiting. You can say this consumer, and a consumer is a user of an API, which at the end is a person who's using an application or interacting, but you can say this consumer can only use this API 100 times a day or 10 times a day, and anything besides that is an anomaly and a threat, and it flags the system. So there's different types of governance you could put over your APIs when you use IAM. I won't go through all this, but the stuff is there. So from, again, a personal and our organization vision, we want to be able to see the future and see the interoperability that's going to be required between apps and patients and partners, our payers, all the data stores where EHR might be, and we want to be able to get ahead of that and put an API manager in front of in front of us, our organization, to say, this is how you can interact with us. That way we can get visibility, we see who's using our APIs, we know who's using them, we know what kind of security they're using, and it's all available through a single endpoint. Right now, if you're familiar with Epic, you can use interconnect to make calls to APIs to Epic, and our goal right now is we use an API that has a bigger vision of the future, but we're hoping to get things away from interconnect and more into API Manager. So it kind of puts something, a forefront at the edge of our organization to say, hey, if you're going to use the API, use this application. We talked to our network team, we've worked with our security team, and we've worked with our database team and OS teams to kind of build a nice solid system where we don't have to go back and ask for security every time we create an API. We've already implemented that with the installation of our product. Or I say InterSystems product. So if I can get technical and describe this as just one node of API Manager and what it is. When you make an install, on the outer box, you'll see we run a Linux OS. InterSystems gives us a Docker container that we use, and I differentiate that from IAM. You'll see IAM on the inner square is different than Docker, the Docker that we get, because InterSystems releases different versions of IAM, and it's not necessarily in sync with Kong. So we're using a Linux OS, we use Docker. IAM is issued to us as a container, but IAM is whitelisted as Kong. And if you've never heard of Kong API, that's basically what IAM is. They've whitelisted a product called Kong, which is openly, the gateway is available out there. You've heard of the product maybe, but InterSystems, they whitelisted it and they issue us containers. So we go to InterSystems, they give us a container, and we run Docker scripts that control these containers. Inside of Kong, it's the Injex engine for reverse proxying, OpenResty for REST functions, and Lua for scripting. So if you're creating applications or add-ons for Kong or IAM, you would be familiar with Lua scripting. If you're making your own custom plugin, you would need to be familiar with Lua scripting. So the next slide is more of the same. This is all the technologies in play that I've come to work with when working with API Manager over the last 3 years. I've had, Red Hat, of course, Docker, InterSystems technology. Kong runs on a back-end Postgres SQL database, and Nginx is our application for reverse proxying, and Lua is for scripting. I said that already. And you can think the easiest thing that when they say what is Kong or what is IAM, you can think of it as basically a reverse proxy application. And through add-ons and plugins, you add features, whether that be rate limiting or whether it be key token authentication, things like that. The plugins add features to what's a reverse proxy. If you're installing the API Manager, you get several features on one node. An admin API, which is the equivalent of doing all the administration things you can do, add services, add routes, add plugins, delete users, create roles. It's everything you could do within the GUI, but available through an administration admin, which leads to the next feature, is Kong Manager, which is the same thing, but it's the GUI version. You get vitals when you can take a look and see how often calls are being made in the health of your system. You also get a dev portal feature, and the dev portal feature allows you to document your APIs and make them publicly available, create access to your APIs where you can share documentation. Anyone who's ever been to App Orchard or looked at any other company's dev portal or went to App Orchard specs and looked at an API and see what parameters are required, same thing, you get that with Kong, the ability for your corporation to create APIs, document them, and share them with other engineers for onboarding, or whoever might want to see what type of APIs you have. You can create a catalog, a library. Some of us are familiar with that. And some of the ports down here just shows how Kong is kind of works through ports, functionalities, and that. But some of our architecture here, where we're doing it, we deploy it, and this is the recommendation, in an enterprise mode. Kong has several features I've described, but in the enterprise mode, you kind of have that top data plane as the only thing available to the internet. So if somebody's trying to talk to an API or send a request to get a response, that's going to come from the internet through our load balancer to our application nodes, our data plane nodes. We have a data plane, application server 1, application server 2, And you can scale up where you can add more data plane nodes. You keep scaling up. From what I've seen from documentation, each node can take 25,000 transactions per second. We're not even approaching that yet. And again, I want to say the data plane, again, is just for proxying data, and it exists there in the lighter blue. But in the lower, darker bluish area, we have the control plane, and that's segmented away from the data features. This is where all the administration stuff goes. The control, you log in, you might create a service, you might create a route, add a plugin. All the changes you can make as an administrator occur on the control plane. When you update the control plane, it sends the latest setup to your nodes, your application nodes. So the whole point, I say all that to say, this allows high availability. You can remove a control plane node and still proxy. People can still proxy because your data plane nodes are still there, they're still facing the internet, and they have the latest configurations. What you can't do is create a new service, you can't create a new route, you can't create anything new because you have your control plane is offline. But you can update your control plane, add another control plane, and point your nodes to the new one, like an upgrade, like you would do in an upgrade. So again, this just shows a hybrid mode where you segment your data plane, which is just only proxying, you show that to the public internet, and only internally can you reach the control plane. You'll never be able to do administration features over the internet unless you intend to do that and you set it up that way. But when you use the control plane, you're internal, you're secure, you're within your network, and you make those changes, and only the data plane is exposed. So it adds security, and it adds high availability when you set up in hybrid mode. A couple use cases I'll describe for us. So these are just use cases why we use API Manager, 3 different ones, how we used it, and what it's doing for us. The first one here, we had a situation where a patient would go to a clinic and we needed to know right away that a new documentation was ready for pickup. What we did was we created a API call where when the patient goes, they go see their e-consult. We, as the UC Davis, we want to know right away that that patient has been seen and there's a new documentation that's ready for pickup. The old way was a little slower and antiquated, but we introduced a new API call. So when the patient goes to that clinic and they're seen and there's a new document ready for pickup, they'll just call our API, and we know that, and it triggers a process in our Go Anywhere system where the document is transferred. So we set up a way where someone who's outside of our clinic sees the e-consult, and they can call an API to us and know right away and we know right away that there's a new document ready for UC Davis to receive. The second case we're talking about FHIR. We've stood up API Manager in front of all of our FHIR calls, our Epic backend, right? So now we can onboard. In this example, we have NHSN. They wanted to work with us for hyperglycemic patients, and they wanted to receive data and make data requests, and they wanted to leverage, we leveraged our API Manager. So essentially, we have another business partner who wants to work with us, build apps, and we want to do it fast, we want to do it efficiently, we want to be able to onboard them, and we can do that through our API Manager, and broker security through API Manager, broker access through our API Manager, know what APIs they're calling, and if our developer portal was full-fledged and set up, we could even point their engineers to our dev portal and say, well, this is how you would design this. So we're able to use API Manager in front of our FHIR, right? So now we can bring on another consumer, and we can give another consumer access. We give them credentials, and we give their use cases, they fill out all the proper documentation, but they can reach out to our FHIR endpoints now through API Manager. So again, we don't have to, we have kind of a onboarding, a doorway to our business partners who want to test stuff and work with us and build applications, and it might require them to reach out to our backend Epic. And the third case here is kind of what I discussed before, is seeing the future of the 21st Century Cures Act. That's going to require data to be interoperated from different locations, and it's going to require APIs. Patients are going to be accessing data most likely through mobile applications, and the number that gets thrown around, like 85, 90% of mobile applications is APIs. So we have to be ready for that. So our API build process, ticket is submitted. We have a form, API Manager intake form that they can fill out, and a developer or engineer can build based off of the intake form. We ask questions: who's the consumer? What service are you trying to reach up to? What's the backend service? Typically, somebody who's coming in and they want an API, they would either know the upstream service and have the information and credentials, or they want to come to our FHIR endpoints, and we're the ones who would onboard them for that because we have all the answers for the questions we would ask them. We test. Testing is usually done with Postman, Insomnia, or Talon. We've all familiar with just tools for the most part, where you test your APIs, you test your calls, request responses, and you see how it works. So that happens, that happens in sync with building in an API manager. Because a lot of times you're building an API manager, you have errors, and you want to pull away from the soft application and say, how does this work with the bare bones testing application? It helps you compare curl commands, things like that. We deliver the product and maintain it. So this is an example of an intake form. What I will do is, I'm going to show you the intake form. It kind of asks questions about, for the customer coming in, who are you? What kind of calls do you want to make? HTTP? Do you have any credentials to give to us that we should proxy? What's your sending IP address? Over time we've learned that the biggest vector right now, API is a big vector, and what most people do, a security threat, is they're going to knock on the door and they're going to try your APIs a lot. So if you can ask the two questions from your consumer: how often are you using the APIs, and what is the IP address you're sending from, mixed with all the other credentials and protocols, you're kind of nipping a few of the top threats, in the bud. So, might ask service name, route name. And what I hope to do now, the next few slides are screenshots, but I'd rather just show you a test system here. So if I log into our test system as a manager, so I log in API Manager, and immediately I can see I have workspaces. These are kind of described as logical separations. If you work with Ensemble and Iris, workspaces, namespaces, logical separations of projects that you can build plugins, build separate things, and they don't know much about each other. Again, I'm logged into, I'm on my network. I'm logged in. I have management features. I can access the management page because I'm on the network. Another thing I'll try to do is I'll send a call to a publicly facing API that we have up, and that is /Star Trek. So if I send an API call to our API Manager, which is publicly available, you guys can send the same call. I send it from my cell phone. I send it to API Manager /Star Trek. I get routed from our service. I have a route created that leads to a service, and we'll see here. If I go to our test system, I have several routes I've created. One of those is our Star Trek route. You'll see right here, Star Trek series. And our route, it can be thought of as an inbound coming into our organization. That's going to lead to a service, and the service on the other end points to a Star Trek endpoint. So basically, I made the call from my phone. I got a response here. I can see all the Star Trek episodes ever made, and I can go here and also see that in the last 5 minutes, there's been 2 requests to my endpoint. This blue line tells me that it's a 200, which is success, and over here again is a 200. So I have 2 requests, and I can see that went into my test workspace. If I scroll down here, it's down here in my test workspace. So that's just showing I sent a call through API Manager. It was proxied. It went upstream. I can see the vitals. I see the health system. I see that one request was made. The second request is from another workspace, our Epic FHIR workspace. But so that's better than me showing the slide of that. So that's a route. Routes define inbound ways to go to API Manager. Services are upstream. And the workspaces I just showed, it shows the workspace, the health of the system. Plugins, I didn't show. Some of the top plugins that we'll work with, that I've worked with in my experience the last 3 years, there's a whole library of plugins. So you might go to the plugin and say, there's so much here. Is there one for me? Is there something that I need? And I've done that too, but I've noticed the top plugins that I've worked with is just basic authorization, setting access control limits to where you put groups on your APIs, where you might make a consumer group, kind of like AD, where you make groups, rights, and privileges to your APIs. IP restriction for only setting allowed IPs and denies. Key authorization for creating a key with API Manager, issuing the key to your consumer, and then requiring your consumer to use that key to access the API. So key authoring and rate limiting, which I've discussed. It's a good idea for rate limiting because people are going to knock at your doors. Again, your APIs are publicly available by the nature. You're going to have stuff out there that's pointing that people can use because that's what APIs are. So you want to have control over that. My experience with Docker, I have a few Docker commands here that just sums up my few Docker commands that I've used. As sketchy as it gets is logging into a container maybe and see what's happening with your Docker container. But this would be my top Docker commands I've used. And also for exporting and importing your Kong configurations, there's a deck application. So a deck dump will back up, sync imports, and a diff will compare. It'll show you what will happen if you do the sync. So it's kind of like it shows you have 3 routes updated, so you kind of test before you sync. References, Kong documentation, WRC, of course, IAM documentation, and Kong's have a great channel. They also have a summit, Kong Summit, every year that I recommend. What's next for us is metrics and analytics, and that's taking the logs that we have for calls that are made and putting into something that's intelligent. It'll show us visually how many calls are being made and where we can kind of take the raw data we get and use Iris or a BPL around that and show something that can be reported on. Upgrading, we're always upgrading. We're trying to go to version 3.0 right now. We're at version 2.8 on our test and 2.3 on our prod system. And versioning and backup is we're trying to figure out a way to the smart way to make changes to Kong and back up those files, basically source control. So that's what's next for us, is doing source control on our configurations. And that's all I have, and I'll take questions, please. That's all. Please.
First off, thank you. That was awesome. I'm just curious if a developer really just wants access to your Epic endpoint, for example, like the data that they need is entirely encapsulated within Epic. Would you anticipate? Thanks. Do you need me to repeat? I'll just repeat it. No worries. So if the data that one of your business partners needs is entirely in Epic, would you anticipate that they still go through API Manager, or would they potentially go through like FHIR.epic.com directly to get access to that data?
You said if I'm sorry, the first part of that question?
If like all the data that one of your business partners needed was in your Epic instance, and they didn't really need any data from any other clinical system, would they go directly to Epic for that, or to your Epic instance, I mean, or would you want them to still go through API Manager? Like, are you thinking that all APIs go through API Manager?
I think the vision is, because we don't want to lose control APIs, or we don't have no rogue APIs out there. I would imagine the vision is that all of APIs would go through API Manager. And you said that the situation was that all they wanted was the FHIR information and nothing else?
Yeah, from Epic, for example. Where Epic has a pretty robust set of FHIR APIs that you could leverage, right? But it seems like you would want all requests to go through your API Manager. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I got my director right there. Just jump in as a visionary. So yeah. Please,
yeah. So I'm Michael Marchand. I'm the person that helped with the really crappy PowerPoint box picture because I'm not a Visio guy. But the long story is that Epic has some specific requirements if you want to hit their direct client. So when I say client, I mean our directory or our test environments. So if you wanted to do that, there's a number of steps that you would have to do, getting a client ID, possibly paying Epic to get access to those things, depending on what your use case is. So our vision is that if you've paid Epic and want to go direct through interconnect with your APIs, you can do that and go to open. If you go to open just to test your build, but you want to work with us before you pay Epic in App Orchard, or whatever they call it today, then you would come through API Manager. And really what we're doing is we've got a multimodal strategy. We're trying to meet people where they're at. So the idea is if we have a partnership with you or you're working with us on an innovative new solution, we would just run you through API Manager because we control that. We control the library of Epic APIs, and we don't have to worry about what Epic does or doesn't need. And I think that's our long-term strategy for not only what we do with Epic is Epic's going to do what Epic's going to do, and people on the outside are going to do that. But for our organization, we want to be able to support both versions as well as exposing applications that don't have a capability to deploy data via FHIR API. So that's in general the high-level scope of the vision, and the poor diagram will get fixed at some point when I have a... Yeah, okay. I'll pass the Dutchie on the right.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm trying to think about how to word this, but from an integration standpoint, I'm an interoperability engineer. And do you know, as your internal folks, do they use the API manager to go through to get to the Epic stuff? So say in Iris, I am doing the DTL, but I need to get something out of Epic that might not come in HL7.
Right.
So I'm doing a FHIR call or I'm doing a web service call. Do you have any of those type of cases where internally your integration developers are leveraging that?
We have plenty because, you know, we started working with API Manager over the last, so 1 year, probably 6, 7 months, 8 months, probably getting it ready. Then we've been working with it for a few years. But we have a lot of integrations right now in Iris that do reach out directly to interconnect. And they're there, they've always been there. And I would say the idea, the hope would be to route those integrations to API Manager eventually. But the fact is, yeah, we have plenty of ones right now that point directly to interconnect. And if somebody came on right now and they wanted something, I would hope we go to API Manager and not route anything new through interconnect anymore. Does that answer your question, or can I do better with that?
I'm just trying to figure out what strategy I want to go.
Right.
Because we want to start, we don't do any FHIR integration right now, but I want to start incorporating that into the integration to give us another option if we don't get the data that we need in the HL7 too.
I'm just going to try to help answer that question. So part of your thought process is accurate, is when you're looking at, you're connecting on Ensemble or Iris for Health to Epic and you want to get access to data. One of the things that we found through our journey is that from a support model standpoint, if you get a ticket and somebody says, my API isn't connecting to something, where do you look? How do you know where you're connecting through? So part of what Carl's talking about is I think what we're trying to do is use the right tool for the job. So if it's an API, FHIR or otherwise, we'll probably start with the API manager to build that connection and then hand that traffic off and let Ensemble or Iris do the transformations and all the other things that it does really well. I think you're going to have to live in a hybrid, and we're living in a hybrid world. If you saw one of the boxes up there is Go Anywhere, we just recently took over all SFTP processes, right? So that's one of the tools in the toolbox. So part of the strategy is just trying to find the right tool for the job, but it doesn't mean it's always the right tool or it's always the way it's going to be done. And when you move outside of that, you just have to do a really good job of documenting it. So part of our requirement is we use ServiceNow's knowledge base, and every individual integration that we have is documented in that, so that if somebody gets a support call, and unfortunately I'm one of those people who have been removed from technology for too long, but I still take support on Fridays because we use a flex schedule. Anywho, so I'll go into the knowledge base and look stuff up, and if it's not there, then everybody gets a series of emails. So that's another thing that we're doing, and we're actually looking to expand our use of ServiceNow. There's another presentation, plug tomorrow's presentation, on our ServiceNow integration, where we're building essentially direct ticketing from ServiceNow or from Ensemble and our infrastructure into ServiceNow. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Mike.
Sorry to bogart your presentation, Carl.
Doing good, thank you.
I figured I'd
Just
help.
keep it up, don't stop.
Oh, where's the hand? Okay. I got multiple jobs here.
Thanks. What were some of your lessons learned from your implementation? Any obstacles or anything? Want to share?
Sometimes you got to get familiar with Docker. I didn't really know much about Docker until I started working with the containers InterSystems gave to us. You might have to realize that your load balancer might send inbound the load balancer IP, so if you're using IP filtering, you'll never see the real source IP because you didn't realize that your load balancer IP is the one that's coming through on every inbound. You might get CORS issues, and you have to work through your Docker script to make sure that you're prepared for CORS issues.
Anything else, Carl? I know I've got another question. Any other lessons learned before I pass it off to the next question? And when is InterSystems going to kick us out of this room? That's the other question.
I was going to say also with containers, though, you also have to make sure, and you referenced Docker, but I know our shop's a lot of podman, so you need to make sure you know which, containerization you're going to use, because I found a lot of documentation when I first started using containers. It was all Docker, and my system admin's like, no, use podman, so I had to try to figure all that out. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the other lessons learned around APIs is organizationally who owns them. So one of the struggles that we have is when you have, and again, we're an Epic shop, so I'll use Epic as an example because that's where we're coming from, but when somebody comes in with an App Orchard app, or whatever Epic calls it today, where they've already built the connections directly to interconnect, it's difficult to know who owns and supports that connection, and sometimes it crosses over. Whereas when something connects through API Manager, it's very clear who owns it, organizationally, from a support model, from a connectivity model. So for us, for me anyway, the lesson learned is it cleans that up. So what we try to do is have the application functional owner own the App Orchard connection. They may call us for support, but really it's just a configuration file and interconnect. But anything that's a true API coming through Manager is us. And that cleans up support really quickly, especially if we do a good job documenting that in the ServiceNow articles in the knowledge base, then that helps as well. So I think from a strategic standpoint is with anything coming in direct, you have to have, there's a lot of things with Epic set up that you have to have in place, but anything coming through API Manager, we control that, and we can monitor and manage that, and that's the idea with the developer portal, is that if you're a partner that wants to do business with UC Davis, we can point you at the developer portal, and even Carl spun some connections up in days where we just do named user and give you access to a library of APIs, and that speeds things up a lot. So just a couple other things. Any other questions while I've turned into moderator? All right, well, if no more questions, everybody thank Carl. Great job, Carl.